This has happened to me way too many times while discussing religion with Christians. They inevitably try to impress me with nice quotes from the Bible or personal testimonies of how that book helped them become a better person. Of course, they don't mind bragging about how good Christianity is, especially compared to the alternatives, but that sort of rhetoric doesn't really work well on people like me. As such, I end up bringing up all sorts of horrible stuff from the Bible that I'm aware of. The problem is, the person I'm engaging with often thinks that they have a trump card that nullifies all my criticism. I could bring up the most inconceivable violation of human rights or mistreatment of people. They think they can counter all of that with just one conveniently small phrase. That phrase is, "But that's in the Old Testament." Today we will learn why that phrase is nothing more than a cheap rationalization that turns an otherwise decent person into a moral coward. Let's get started. I've been discussing and debating religion for a long time now, so trust me when I tell you that there is no shortage of bad excuses given by the average religious person for their strange beliefs. But the one that attempts to shrug away all criticisms of the biblical God and stories by simply pointing out that it's all in the Old Testament stands out as especially idiotic. Don't get me wrong, I completely understand that very few Christians have come up with those excuses on their own. More often than not, these excuses are ill-conceived arguments from Christian apologetics. Professional idiots like them come up with poorly thought-out excuses that trickle down over time through the church hierarchy all the way down to the common Christian. Since I know that the average Christian is not a moron like those apologists, I present the following thoughts for their consideration. If someone points out that the God of the Bible endorses sexism, homophobia, slavery, murder, etc. throughout the pages, please, for the love of that God, just stop before your knee-jerk reaction makes you want to say, "But that's in the Old Testament." Let's think through the implication of that statement first. When you say that that is in the Old Testament, what are you really saying? You're not saying that Yahweh was a terrible monster, are you? You're not saying that Yahweh should be held accountable for his involvement with any of the morally reprehensible actions we're talking about, are you? This is a very important thing to not gloss over. Do you support all those acts of evil as commanded by that God in the Old Testament? If I sent you back in time and gave you the power to stop Yahweh and his people from their genocidal rampage, would you try to fight Yahweh? If you had the power, would you try to go and tell Yahweh's people that owning other human beings and passing them on as property is immoral and they shouldn't be listening to Yahweh? If not, it is irrelevant in which testament your God's evil is recorded. If you are not against Yahweh and the immoral, spineless executors of his will in the Old Testament, I fail to see what the Old Testament and the New Testament divide has got to do with the charges brought against this biblical God. That excuse makes it sound like there's some sort of arbitrarily drawn line through time before which all those horrible things were good and now they're bad. On top of that, you actually make your case significantly worse by telling us that you believe that Jesus and Yahweh are one, meaning that not only are you not denouncing Yahweh, the monster from the Old Testament, you are worshipping and promoting the worship of that monster via rebranding. If your belief was that Jesus is some God that showed up to fight Yahweh's evil and taught us to despise Yahweh, that would have been a very different situation. But that isn't what you believe in, right? Your attempt at distancing Christianity from the Old Testament already indicates that you are well aware of how immoral the content of that part of the Bible is. Despite that discomfort, you somehow don't seem to realize how Jesus being God himself means that he ends up inheriting the responsibility for the Old Testament atrocities. At least the responsibility to condemn a being like Yahweh and his immoral commands. Realize that when you ignore the Old Testament and request we focus on the New, you are using the New Testament to sanitize the historical records of your God's behavior that the Old Testament supposedly truthfully documents. No amount of New Testament-based PR campaign with its "Love Thy Neighbor Jesus" image will ever sanitize the record-setting barbaric cruelty of the Old Testament God. If you are one of those people who has been using this excuse, I hope that going forward you'll refrain from doing so. This has been The Scientalist. See you in the next video.